So we'll go ahead and get started. This is Adrian Hernandez, and I'm very pleased to moderate this special series for Collaboratory Grand Rounds to discuss central IRBs or approaches to that for multi-center studies. This has tremendous interest nationally, as it's been recognized an important process in terms of ensuring protection of human subjects, but also has faced challenges in terms of ensuring the efficient conduct of multi-center studies. Today we have a special session to talk about different models or different approaches towards this. Last week we had a great session learning from what the city group has done in terms of understanding what are the potential needs and potential solutions for this that turned out to be the largest attendance for Collaboratory Grand Rounds. So today's a little bit different than what we've done in the past. So we have several different speakers to talk about different perspectives, and especially from the perspectives of Ctsa and PCORnet, as these networks are really trying to streamline and provide administrative simplicity. So let me advance the next slide. So the concept here, and this is certainly emphasized from Cindy Hahn's discussion last week, is not necessarily new, but there has been a lot of attention in the recent years. And especially now, where there's this constellation of a so-called perfect storm, where we have national interest from NIH, from PCORI, from FDA, from funders, industry, and also from health systems, centers, those who are conducting research. It really is now a great time to consider what should be the optimal approach here. And again, taking on this challenge is certainly daunting in a way, but the groups here that we'll highlight are really thinking about the complexity and different issues for this. Go ahead and advance. And this just shows what we did last week, which again, I want to refer everyone to last week's archives and grand rounds on this topic. If you missed it, it was a great presentation and overview. And also encourage everyone, if they haven't explored the city website on what they have proposed as an approach towards central IRB and understanding what the issues are. Next slide. And now, as we go forward, this has become of great interest as PCORnet advances into the next phase of transitioning from research readiness to actually conducting research. And a hallmark for PCORnet is to emphasize administrative simplicity with the approach towards a simple IRB review process as a major need, and also uniting the varied interest of the networks within PCORnet, as well as aligning with other efforts such as the Ctsa. Next. We'll certainly want to make sure that people understand some of the concepts here, and also make sure that we try to, as much as possible, provide clarity in terms of types of IRB models. And it's important to note that there's often confusion about these terms, and I'm sure others on Grand Rounds here will help clarify this regarding concepts of shared models versus non-shared models, and also different concepts in terms of how things are approached in terms of the regulatory review, the local context review, and also sharing oversight, as well as sharing information and considering what needs to be done locally versus nationally for operationalizing different models. Next. One concept that people have certainly talked about as an important area is the concepts around Reliance Agreements. These have also varied significantly across different networks in the past and also different institutions, and they do vary based on scope and often have considered really more focused Reliance Agreements for a particular trial or particular network that's focused on a disease state, and also considers whether things can be used in that fashion on a voluntary basis as opposed to all in or none in. Next. So we'll have these discussions in terms of IRB models, IRBRely, IRBShare, and IRBChoice. And with that, let me go ahead and pass the baton to Petra Kaufman, who can do the first introductions here.
Well, thank you, Adrian. So I'll just take a couple of minutes. So I'm delighted that we have this opportunity to coordinate between the NIH Collaboratory, PCORnet, and the Ctsa program. I think the overview we just heard really resonated with me, as did an analogy that Rob Califf had used in the past, where he talked about the Great Fire of Baltimore in 1904 that burned all day, even though fire departments came from the entire region to help. And the reason that the fire couldn't, be extinguished was that the hoses were not compatible with each other and with the hydrants. And there are two things about this analogy that I really like. One is the urgency. So the U.S. population is aging. We have the highest healthcare cost relative to GDP, and we do not have the best outcomes. So I think our future as a society to some degree depends on our ability to gather medical evidence more effectively. And streamlining IRB is one important way how we can do that. And the other thing in that analogy of the fire where, nothing fit together is that we really have a historic opportunity now to coordinate. And I think if we can find the common ground between these different efforts of streamlining IRBs, that'll be a great win for all of us and will make clinical research so much better and avoid maybe a new world where instead of having multiple local IRB reviews, we have many different ways how people have to connect with a single IRB. So I'm just delighted about this opportunity, and I don't want to take any more time and introduce the IRBRely initiative that has been ongoing in the Ctsa network, funded by MCATS, and has had many investigators from different institutions participate under the leadership of Dr. Alan Green, who is the chair of psychiatry at the Geisel School of Medicine at Dartmouth, and also the director of Synergy, which is the name of the Dartmouth Clinical and Translational Science Institute, and the associate dean there for Clinical and Translational Science. I'd like to hand it over to Dr. Green. Alan?
Dr. Kaufman, thank you so much for introducing me and for your support of this whole project. I'm going to talk about this National IRB Reliance Network of the Ctsa Consortium. We call it IRBRely. And I am the PI, as Petra Kaufman indicated, for this project on behalf of the CTSAs. Barbara Beer from Harvard, from the Harvard Catalyst, has been working with us as a Reliance advisor, and she will be available to answer questions as well if necessary. Michelle Cobb from the University of Wisconsin and Saboon Winkler from Harvard are involved as helping us with regulatory issues, and Amar Das from Dartmouth has been leading an informatics group, and you'll see what we're trying to do, building an informatics platform. Now, I think we all know that IRB review of multi-site studies is a national issue, as Adrian and as Petra were saying, that multi-site studies review by local IRBs make for inefficiencies and questions about the value of redundant reviews. It can delay initiation of studies and may not even provide adequate protection for human subjects. So I think there's a general sense that there's some sort of a need for a collaborative review. And in fact, NIH came out with a draft policy in early December about this, indicating the intent or the possibility of forcing multi-site clinical research studies funded by NIH to have a single IRB of record. And my understanding is that they will be coming out with a final policy shortly. So the challenges for doing this, we heard some of this last week on the Ctsa presentation, but there's a reluctance to defer review from one institution to another, questions about liability, administrative challenges, confusion about responsibilities, worries about can the other IRB do it as well as we do it, ensuring that local requirements are addressed, and then just changing processes and a certain inertia that comes up. So what we did for the CTSAs, and this is a project that's been going on for about 11 months now, what we did is get a group of investigators of CTSAs together and try to figure out where there were CTSAs that were basically the base of their own collaborative IRB programs. And for instance, the UC Braid system, encompassing all the University of California CTSAs, has a system where they work together. University of Texas at Southwestern has one, and you can see on the graphs the colored stars. Vanderbilt has IRBShare, and we'll hear more about that later with a number of sites throughout the country. Harvard Catalyst, which is now has been renamed the New England Reliance Network, has a number of sites in New England and actually now spreading throughout the country. University of Wisconsin-Madison has the so-called March Consortium and the Greater Plains Consortium, same thing. Ohio Collaborative, based at Case Western, has a number of sites, as you can see, throughout Ohio. And University of New Mexico is involved as well with sites in Utah and elsewhere. So when we saw all these, and we call these are essentially regional groups that have worked together. Most of them are using a Reliance system, and then there's the IRBShare system out of Vanderbilt. And we recognize that while there are barriers for IRBs to work together in one way or another, there are regional models that are working, and there seems to be a willingness, at least within the CTSA consortium, to trust and test a national model. So I'm unable to advance the slide for some reason. Okay, sorry. Can you go back one? There we are. So what we did was looked at a number of different possibilities. We thought, okay, well, should we, for the CTSA, create one central IRB, such as Neuronext or StrokeNet, or things like the NCI uses? And we decided that would simply be not sensible in a way for a big program like the CTSAs. However, we wanted the capacity to be able to function like a central IRB if we needed it. We thought that since some of these are studies, they're coming out of academic centers, some of them may be high-risk studies, thought that maybe this should not be through a classic commercial IRB. And so that left us with the IRBShare, which is a joint review model we'll hear about, and IRBRely or Reliance model. And the group decided that for the purposes of the CTSA, we thought that the Reliance model would make most sense, and I'll try to tell you why. And you'll hear more about the Share model at the next presentation, which is a joint review model. The Reliance model, where there's a single IRB of record, chosen on a study-by-study basis, usually but not always. I'll show you how that may evolve. For the life of the study, cradle to grave, involving a reviewing IRB and a set of relying institutions. Please advance the slide for me. I can't. I'm locked. I can't do it. Thank you. The goals of the IRBRely project are to develop a standard IRB Reliance Agreement with supporting operating procedures, standard procedures, and an informatics platform that is not necessarily specific to a research area or to a particular region of the country. It can be used for small studies. So, for instance, a multi-site study involving 2 sites or 4 sites or 8 sites or 15 sites might use the classic Reliance model where the IRB of record would vary from one place to another depending on where the PI was based, perhaps. But if you have a study with 50 sites or 75 sites, this system could also then morph into what is essentially a central IRB, where there's one IRB for a large study and all the sites that are involved have to sign on to this. It can be applied to a range of research areas, and we expect that this could be expanded beyond the CTSAs themselves. And we decided that we would also, as we're building this, identify a clinical trial that would allow us the opportunity to test what we're doing. Next slide, please. So we've set up this program, the IRBRely, that has an executive committee made up of the Ctsas coming from these regional sites that I talked about. We have an operations committee. We have a regulatory committee. We have an informatics group that's building this informatics infrastructure to support it, and we're trying to evaluate this as we go along. Next slide, please.
For us, because we actually have something you can...
So the components of IRBRely, so let me take a little time to explain this. We have a master reliance agreement, IRB master reliance agreement, and this is a way that sites can sign on. If they sign on together, they will be in this IRBRely network, which will allow them to work together. We are in the process of developing the final form of this master reliance agreement. Right now, and you'll hear more in a minute or two, that we're working with Duke as our pilot, and we are using them as sort of a beta test of this agreement. And we're going to be going out to all the other CTSAs to get comments on the agreement that we've made to finalize it. But what we've done is taken reliance agreements that existed throughout the country and harmonized them, put them together into one that we think will work nationally. We did the same thing with standard operating procedures, getting them from various sites, putting them together, and putting a set of definitions of various responsibilities, which I will show more about in a minute, and coming up with a standard set of operating procedures. We are building an informatics platform. We have a website that you can go to that gives some information, but we're in the process of building this. It will be an end-to-end workflow-based platform for study teams and sites to communicate with each other and to run this whole IRBRely process. Next slide, please. So the pilot, as I mentioned, will be using the CARA registry. The CARA registry is a group of 63 institutions that have been studying juvenile rheumatoid arthritis, and they are launching a new study that is essentially tracking these individuals in this registry longitudinally. Duke came to us and asked, would we help them by setting up an IRBRely system within this? There are 63 sites, as I mentioned. We decided we would work with 15 of them as sort of as a beta test. Laura Schanberg at Duke is the PI of this, and the Duke Clinical Research Institute, or DCRI, is also involved as sort of as a lead study team, which I'll explain. This study, the pilot study, is giving us the opportunity to obtain feedback from sites about the agreement, about the SOPs, and to give us information which we're going to use to roll this out beyond the pilot. And we're testing various forms and workflows and the like to help us build the informatics platform. Next slide, please. These are the sites that are considering, and most of them have agreed now to be participating in the pilot. That is, again, 16 of the 53 are signing on now as part of IRBRely. The other 48 will, at the end of 1 year, will all roll into the IRBRely system. So this eventually will encompass the entire group of CARA registry sites. Next slide. So within IRBRely, this sets of requirements and responsibilities are going to be defined later, but there's a reviewing IRB, there are relying sites, there's, for any study, an overall PI and a lead study team, and then there's a local site PI and would be, therefore, a relying study team. And we have defined something that we call a point of contact in an institution. I'll try to explain these now. Next slide, please. So the reviewing IRB is the otherwise known as the IRB of record, would oversee the study on behalf of relying sites from cradle to grave, beginning to end. The selection of a reviewing IRB could be, it is possibly the IRB of the overall PI, but it doesn't need to be. And we're defining now what a reviewing IRB should be like if it's going to be supporting a study with, let's say, 50 sites or 75 sites. It would be very different if it's supporting a study of 2 or 4 sites. But nonetheless, it would work the same way. It would review initial submission, amendments, continuing reviews, reportable events, and the like. And it would approve a formal consent with specific language in it that could be adapted in a limited way for site-specific issues. local names, and the like. It would act as a HIPAA privacy board and therefore make determinations regarding waivers and alterations of authorization. It would review any conflict of interest management plans provided them by the relying site. Next slide, please. The relying sites, these are the sites that agree to cede IRB review to the reviewing IRB through the IRBRely agreement that we've put together and are still modifying. Key responsibilities of a relying site: ensuring the study teams are trained, ensuring their research study teams comply with conditions of IRB approval, with other local institutional policies and applicable human subjects regulations, and they will be responsible for reviewing and managing conflict of interest issues. Next slide. The overall PI and the lead study team, so the overall PI will designate a group to work with him or her. The lead study team has the responsibilities that include submitting materials to the reviewing IRB for all sites, including changes of protocol, continuing reviews, reportable events, and providing study materials, including the proposed consent and form template and so forth, to the relying sites. For the IRB pilot, as I was mentioning, the overall PI is Laura Schanberger Duke, and the lead study team in this case would be DCRI. Next slide. So, site PIs and relying study teams. The site PI is the local PI at a particular institution. The relying study team is the team whose institution has ceded review to the reviewing IRB. And the responsibility of a local team and a local study team would be to follow the policies and procedures of the reviewing IRB, providing the lead study team, remember that's at the overall PI's group, with information about study progress for continuing review, and possible local events that are reported to the reviewing IRB, using the reviewer IRB's consent form template, but it might be slightly modified for local conditions, and obtaining authorization from their IRBRely points of contact. And again, we'll have another slide on that. In the case of personnel changes, updates to conflict of interest, changes that may be affected by state law, for instance, or institutional requirements. Next slide, please. So these regulatory points of contact are individuals at each site who would decide whether to serve as a reviewing IRB, for instance, or to cede IRB review on behalf of their institution, would authorize changes in order to confirm institutional requirements have been met for a particular study, serve as a resource for study teams regarding the IRBRely initiative, and they would be responsible for communicating their institution's decision regarding Reliance, provide information to the reviewing IRB regarding various state requirements, for instance, or particular institutional issues that need to be considered, and affirm that the local study team personnel have indeed completed their institutional required training. That's a local issue. Next. So that's an overview of where we have been and are, but just to show what where we're going in the next month or two, we are implementing and rolling out this IRBRely pilot. A number of sites have already signed on. Of the 16, we expect them all to be part of this by September 1st, working with the IRB, with the CARA group at DCRI. We are in the process, as I mentioned, finalizing the Master National Agreement. We're getting information from CARA, which is now going to be put into what we already have, and then we're submitting it to all the CTSAs nationally to get comments back. And by early fall, we expect to have a final National Master Reliance Agreement that will be able to be signed on to by all the CTSAs. We're bringing, therefore, CTSA sites and their affiliates into the IRBRely network. Right now, these 7 sites that I talked to you about, among them actually encompass about 30 CTSAs, and there are 62 of them. So many of the CTSAs are already involved in this. We are, over the next months, we'll be rolling out this IRBRely informatics platform, an open source platform that will be interoperable, so that if there's a local set of informatics platforms or conditions, we want to make sure that our system can talk to it. And we're collaborating with the Rare Disease Clinical Research Network of NCATS, with Citi, and with PCORnet to try to make sure lessons learned, we do the best we can. Next slide and last slide. Thank you. So you can look further at IRBRely.org for some information. This is now just a informational website, but as time goes on, there'll be more and more built into this. Thanks very much for the opportunity to present this, and I look forward to questions as we move forward.
Thanks, Alan. Next, we'll transition over to Rachel Florence, and she'll introduce Todd Rice. Rachel?
Thanks, Adrian. And Dr. Green, that was a great presentation. Thank you for sharing that with us. So I'm Rachel Florence. I'm the Program Director for PCORnet, and Petra Kaufman and I have been working closely to sort of really help leverage and accelerate collaborations between the Ctsa work and the PCORnet work. Like the Ctsa's, PCORnet has been working hard on streamlining administrative simplicity issues that Adrian described, so including contracting, but as well, of course, the IRB situation. So I have the pleasure today to introduce Todd Rice, and Todd is representing the Vanderbilt University effort and IRBShare. And so, Todd, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Rachel. I'd like to just thank you guys and everybody for attending and the opportunity to share with you another national IRB model that we have kind of been a key role in developing here at Vanderbilt and are using. And I'll describe it a little bit, and then I'll show you kind of how it works and our experience with it. And most of this will be about IRBShare. The last slide will be about kind of the next steps in IRBShare becoming IRBChoice. Maybe. So first, IRBShare. The brief history is that this all started with a meeting grant from the National Center for Research Resources, NCRR, and we brought together a bunch of different people from IRBs and industry and the government and compliance and legal to try and come up with a new model where we could talk about kind of a national IRB reliance and sharing model that we needed, as Alan kind of said, because there was significant lack of trust between IRBs, and many institutional and IRB policies had rules against transferring oversight. And in fact, that's still true today. There are still some institutions that say they just can't and won't transfer oversight. So our goals in bringing all these people together were to maintain the high level of protection for human subjects that were in multi-center trials, try and really accelerate study startup, create a scalable IRB reliance model that didn't require ongoing funding and was open to all institutions, and then also to get IRBs to talk to each other and have transparency between IRBs. Since we are all supposed to be doing kind of similar or the same things, we thought kind of shared expertise and practices was another common goal. And so we came up with a shared review model, and this is what it looks like. So there is a lead IRB. The local investigator actually submits their study to their local IRB, which is going to become the lead IRB. The study is reviewed according to the risk level. If it's expedited, it can be reviewed by a subcommittee. If it's greater than minimal risk, it has to go to a full committee, and that review is done. And the committee's responsibility is, just as it always is, determine whether the study meets all the regulatory guidelines under the Code of Federal Regulations 46111. So this is business as usual for this lead IRB. Then what they do is, once they've approved the study, they upload all of their study documents into a IRBShare technological system that's available online for all of the documents. And these include things such as, and it depends a little bit on the study, but as you can imagine, it'll include things like the IRB application, any of the consent forms, which then become the model consent form for the study, protocol and/or investigator brochures or device manuals, the meeting minutes. So if it went to a full committee meeting, the meeting minutes that are redacted for sensitive data and people's names, and the determination letter. All of those get uploaded into the electronic system. Then subsequent sites that are also doing the same study will be told by an investigator they're doing the study. The study has already been approved by another site in IRBShare, and the documents are in the system. So that IRB will then go and download the approved documents. and do what's called a shared review process. And in doing that, they look at the review documents and they say, you know, yep, that seems like the right determination, and it seems like everything was on the up and up with the first site. Now we need to look at what we're going to do at our site specifically from local contexts. And that local context can include things like how our pharmacy works, or how we're going to do billing, or how we're going to do conflict of interest, those sorts of things. And I have a slide later on that'll talk to you about some of the local context issues. That sharing site in the shared review process does not require a full committee review. This can all be done by a subcommittee, and for example, at Vanderbilt, that subcommittee is one of the chairs of one of our committees that verifies that the lead IRB's determination is one that is appropriate, and then looks at their own local context issues. Then once that happens, the local IRB, so that IRB that did the shared review process, maintains oversight of the study. So they're responsible for their local AEs, they're responsible for their local investigators, their training, their compliance, and all of that. The same model actually occurs for amendments and continuing reviews. So if an amendment or a continuing review time is up, the lead IRB, the local investigator, submits whatever it is, the continuing review of the amendment to that lead IRB, the local IRB at that site. It's reviewed according to whatever risk level and however they need to review the amendment or the continuing review. The committee does just what they've done before, as we said in the last example, business as usual at the local site. And once again, they upload those documents. So they upload the continuing review application, they will upload the consent form that they've now reapproved, any meeting minutes, and determination letter. The sharing sites do the same thing. They download those materials. A subcommittee looks at them and says, you know, it looks like everything was on the up and up. Again, they can look at local context, although all of this has kind of already been set forth in the initial review, but maybe there's some new local context with an amendment, for example. And they say, we approve the study here and we keep oversight. The local IRB maintains their oversight. So that was sort of how it was all envisioned. As we've got this up and running, we've discovered that there are actually multiple entries into this system. And a number of our studies in the system are studies that have been approved even before the system was up and running that are now looking to increase enrollment and add sites. So there are a number of ways that a study could come in. If it's a brand new study, many times the study identifies a lead investigator and a lead IRB and says, submit to your IRB just like you would, and then we'll upload it into IRBShare. If it's a study that's already ongoing and they're adding sites, many times one of the sites that already has an approval will then just upload all of their documents that they've already done everything and gotten their approval for other sites to do the shared review process when they're coming on as a new one. So that's sort of the two different entry points. Then the lead IRB, once they have an approval and they're uploading, that approved consent form is sent to the new site PIs and the upcoming sites as kind of the model consent form. And that can be modified some to include your site's local language, but in essence, that's the template that we're used to seeing the kind of the coordinating center reply. And then we've talked a lot about the subcommittee doing the shared review process. The letter, the determination that the local PI gets is always from their own IRB, and their interaction is always with their own IRB. They don't have to interact with an IRB that's remote to them that they may or may not know. It's always with their own IRB. So as you can see, there is some sharing that occurs in this. If you look at this kind of top circle in IRBShare, the federal regulations are actually shared in the initial study review. They're done by the lead and then shared with the local, and the local context is actually done by this green box of the local relying IRB. If you look at this compared to a true central IRB where there's just one IRB that's kind of on the hook, then many of those, and it depends a little bit on the model, but in many of those, that lead IRB is doing both the federal regulations and all of the local context for all of the sites, or in conjunction with the local site is doing the local context. One thing to remember is that this is all about the IRB regulatory part, and a big part of what we consider IRB or human research protections is stuff that's not in the federal regulations. So these are the subsequent rows, such as billing and qualifying clinical trial, biosafety, radiation safety. And in all of the models that we have right now, those things are all taken care of locally. So when we first actually were involved as a site that was doing Reliance in a central IRB, we thought we were going to offload a bunch of work and get rid of a lot of this stuff. But it turns out that we still have to do a lot of the work, just not the federal regulation part of it. If you look at amendments, for example, that are study-wide, how those are handled can be either through, in the share model, they're handled by the lead IRB and then local context by the local IRB, whereas in central models, they may be handled by just the lead IRB. Continuing review, similarly, if you have local amendments, they may be handled in different ways depending on the model. But there's lots of sharing in all of these models. So where are we with this and what have we learned? So our IRBShare master agreement, so there's one agreement to all of this. Once you sign it, you're in IRBShare and you can use IRBShare for any study that another institution is also in IRBShare for. There's not an individual agreement for each study. It's one agreement for the whole system. That was finalized in October of 2012. People started signing up at that point. Hospitals, medical centers, universities, research institutions in the IRBShare network. And you can see based off the color coding on these, if you're part of a CDRN, there's 23 sites, 23 CDRN sites that are part of IRBShare. And if you look at the far right, you can see that there's 28 states that are represented. So again, essentially a national model that includes places from all over the country. AHRP accredited down here in kind of the last corner, bottom right box, 43 AHRP accredited sites and 39 Ctsa institutions. Are already signed up and part of IRBShare. And in fact, if you're on this call and your center is listed, it means your center is already signed up and part of IRBShare. And in theory, you can use the IRBShare system. Not all of these centers have used the system yet, but they've all at least signed the master agreement. So we've talked about 58 institutions. In general, we have now 28 reliances. About 80% of those are greater than minimal risk alliances. And we have a median of 14 days from submission to approval of the shared expedited site. We've developed some transparency and shared expertise, and institutions that have been unable to transfer oversight can actually use some of these documents and see how another IRB did it and help streamline their processes, and in addition, some shared practices of documents, templates, application forms, that sort of stuff. There are obviously challenges, and as Adrian said kind of at the beginning of this, there are challenges to any of these reliance models. And these are fairly common challenges to IRBShare, central IRBs. That is getting IRBs and PIs to understand what their responsibilities are in the different reliance model, coordinating and implementing these different models across diverse studies and institutions, competing IRB priorities, whether it be manpower or number of studies or those sorts of competing priorities, managing the expectations of IRBs and PIs. For example, an IRB reliance doesn't mean you get to actually relinquish the human research protections part. It does mean you get to maybe relinquish the regulatory part. We've been asked about including institutions that don't have an FWA in IRBShare, which is obviously a challenge in any IRB mechanism, and some of those are small community hospitals and how to effectively provide efficiency and good oversight for them. In all of this, we've kind of realized that there's probably not a one-size-fits-all, not a one answer to every single study that's out there. And from that recognition came a NHLBI-funded R01 called IRBChoice, which is actually to expand IRBShare's master agreement and system so that it will support more than just a shared reliance model, but it will also support a fully seeded reliance model. And then the goal, once we have that up and kind of running, which should be later this fall, will be to enable the IRBs to actually identify the reliance model that works best for that specific situation. So it might be a different model for a different PI, or it might be a same model for a different institution, or every study may have a different model for that IRB. And the goal is to gain and obtain data as to why IRBs chose the model they did, and learn which of these models may be best for different study types. I think that's my last slide.
Okay. Thanks, Todd, for great overview for IRBShare and also where things are going with IRBChoice. So we will open this up for comments. Please, just as a reminder, type in your question into the chat box and send it to everyone. Let me first, just to get some general thoughts, if we could unmute Pearl O'Rourke. I just would like to get her general thoughts on challenges here for the different approaches for our IRBs. What are things that need to make sure that we address? Pearl, if you're still on.
Yep, can you hear me?
Yeah, so Pearl.
Okay, great. Hi, Adrian, and a lot of good friends there. I think the two presentations were great. And we are working with Adrian with the PCORnet to, I think as Petra said at the beginning, try to, not recreate the wheel here, but to work with IRBRely, work with IRBShare, and really come up with, what can be a reasonable approach for PCORnet. I think the challenges that I see, are a couple. Number one, I think it's imperative that we do get to just a few single approaches. I think probably, any of you running IRBs, most of us have had to change our internal operations to have, a very senior person who's just dealing with external IRBs. And I think right now it's kind of, if you see one Reliance Agreement, you've seen one. And I think we have to get rid of that. And I think IRBRely is just a great stake in the ground to hopefully improve that. I think the other piece that we definitely need to keep aware of are a lot of people see seating IRB review and it's like, oh, great, you guys won't have as much to do. Our experience is it's different work. And I think keeping in touch with all of the institutional requirements, the communications, I do not see this as certainly cost savings. And I think we need to put some data behind that for all of our institutions. And the final comment I'll make is investigators have to learn how to deal with these systems. We are the central IRB for NeuroNext, which is really a Cadillac model in terms of wonderful funding and support from NIH, and certainly when Petra was at NINDS, her personal support. And a key position that we put in place was an Irb Liaison who is embedded in the study team. And that person is the communication node between all the sites and the IRB. This makes sense if you have a large study, 50-site study. I don't know how many of you are, if you're doing a non-share model, how many of you have the capacity for taking, one-off calls from 50 sites for every IRB-related question. So we really try to push this through a single person. And, again, that's an added expense for investigators, but I think we need to figure out how can investigators best communicate with these different models. And again, it's very different if you're talking a 50-site interventional study versus a 2-site observational study. So again, one size doesn't fit all. But I'll stop there rather than meandering on, but thank you very much for the presentations.
That's great. I'd like Alan and Todd to comment a little bit about what Pearl was discussing, and in particular, making sure, hearing your views in terms of, what's the outcome that we're trying to ensure we optimize. Pearl is raising this issue that would we somehow be, say, shifting work or costs, so then the net gain is neutral, or how do we reassure that? Or, is the outcome really trying to ensure that time to IRB approval is much quicker? Okay. Alan or Todd?
Sure. This is Alan. I can take it on first. Maybe Tom wants to try. I think that we are trying to make things more efficient in terms of time. There's no question about that, and make sure that that the individuals involved in the study are adequately protected. The question about whether it's going to be less expensive, I assume that some costs may well be able to be shifted to a central IRB or a single IRB of record system. I think that what we're trying to right now figure out is and one of the questions that someone asked in the chat box here I see is how much effort will be involved if there's a single IRB for a very large study. And what we're trying to figure out, and we're in the process of doing this is now, what kind of IRB could be able to support a study of 50 sites or 75 sites, and what resources would it need to be able to stand that up? And should there be a handful of standing IRBs throughout the country that are able to do this? And so I think that's part of what we're trying to figure out and consider. I might say also, Adrian, that in terms of the existing Reliance agreements, there are already thousands of studies that have already been stood up using a system very much like IRBRely. So it's an ongoing system that seems to work. What it hasn't been tried yet in a very large study, 50 sites or 75 sites. But there are studies going on with 10 sites, and it seems to work very, very well. I don't know if Adrian, if Todd has some other comments.
Yeah, I think briefly the beginning I agree with that, which is that I think the goal of all of these endeavors are to try and improve efficiency. In an ideal world, we would maintain quality or even improve quality, but as many of you who are part of IRBs know, we currently have zero metric for measuring quality. We aren't sure what it is in an IRB review, and therefore determining how we're going to maintain it or even improve it is not the first step that we take. We have to figure out what it is. Efficiency, we have some idea of kind of how efficient we are, and hopefully any of these models, the goal is to, and the result will be to improve efficiency in the regulatory process.
Hey, I know the issue about quality came up last week as well, and I guess in that context, it's actually there's an implication that actually all local reviews are of high quality. And in other contexts, often we see that there's such an extreme local variation that's unexplained.
Adrian, Adrian, I could comment on that because I think that that's one of the things that we hope that IRBRely will help us figure out. There's no question that if you've seen one IRB, you've seen one IRB, as you're pointing out, and that the decisions that are being made are not necessarily harmonized nationally. And so we expect that the system that we're trying to set up, and we are setting up, will help define how to standardize processes among IRBs throughout the country. And I think that's a real issue.
Yeah, and we see that especially when we see responses to multi-center trials that are going across not only IRBs, hundreds of IRBs here in the U.S., but then also extending across the borders. Let me turn to Greg Simon.
Adrian, if I am still unmuted, could I second what Alan just think? I think this is great opportunity for getting some harmonization for IRB review, and I think, that would just be terrific.
Yeah, and the reason I was bringing it up is that want to make sure that the current system people don't necessarily consider it as being the gold standard for quality, because I'm not sure that's the case. And that harmonization would actually bring that out, hopefully in a very clear manner. Greg, what do you have to say about all this?
Sure.
And what's your response?
My specific question was, and my experience is primarily with IRBs that function within large health systems within the HMO research network. And one barrier we sometimes encountered toward IRB reliance across institutions is that sometimes these IRBs take on, either of their own accord or from some institutional initiative, other responsibilities that lie outside of at least their formal regulatory role. Things like, does this study create liability risks for the institution? Is there a reputational risk? Would the results of this study potentially be harmful to the institution's reputation? Would this have a negative impact on the operations, daily operations of the healthcare delivery system? And those clearly are local issues. And the IRBs some have, for better or worse, sometimes been given that responsibility. And the question is, where does that go in a reliance agreement? Yeah. I wonder if you've encountered anything like that and how you sort of strip off those other responsibilities and where they land.
I could comment. I mean, my sense is that there are responsibilities according to the federal regs that IRBs are given. And as you very correctly point out, that many IRBs have accumulated over time a number of other responsibilities, even including scientific review, and it really doesn't belong there. Many of these things are not part of the classic IRB protections and what they're supposed to be doing. So IRBRely would be using the IRB for what it's supposed to be doing. Local issues about feasibility in a local site, what it does to the reputation of an institution, etc., that becomes a local issue and has to remain as a local issue. I know, Barbara, do you have a comment?
I agree with that. I mean, I do think that there is a role for the institution in terms of a thumbs up or thumbs down on any given trial. That this is an evolution from an IRB being an institutional review board to really a human subjects review board for ethical considerations, rather than taking on through the IRB office and therefore what has been known as the IRB itself, all of these other functions. So I think the challenge, which we're all getting more comfortable with, but is still an area of evolution, is just articulating the various responsibilities and placing them in the right place for execution. And I think we've spoken pretty well to that. And IRBRely is based on the cumulative experience of these 7 regional networks. We, for instance, at Harvard have done something like 2,300 IRB reviews as a Reliance review. Again, none of them, I think, 50 studies. There was a huge learning curve in terms of the institutional responsibilities, and I think we're now much, much more comfortable with it. Then we moved forward with NeuroNext with under Pro work, and there are 50 study trials, and really learned again what additional responsibilities and compliance issues and sort of process issues needed to be considered in a multi-state and complex arena, which is now incorporated. But still, that does not abrogate institutional responsibilities entirely. It saves a lot of full board review time. It saves a lot in terms of continuing reviews and amendments. But there are other responsibilities, which, as we say, the institution has to figure out a different process for than one that we've used historically.
Just on that, in the last few comments about that, I think it will be important as these programs go forward in terms of actually understanding really where the benefits are achieved, and because I think that'll hopefully really grow the continued interest there and actually implementation of this. Because at least one where I have is that we have these programs available. They may be very good, but they won't get used unless people really understand how this actually achieves efficiency.
Well, if the NIH in fact comes out with its policy that requires a single IRB review for anything that's funded by NIH involves more than one site, I think that will certainly encourage use.
Just to support what Pearl said, if we can settle on, one preferably or a handful of models, this will be much, much easier to achieve efficiencies than if we're still dealing with, 10 different models and you have to know which specific, sort of course one has to take for which kind of agreement. And that the real efficiency will come when we are harmonized and then can build systems around that harmonization and workflow, which the IT infrastructure that we're building at IRBRely will support. And I do think there are efficiencies in process time and FTEs that can be achieved.
Someone asked the question, Adrian, in the chat box about how we anticipate rolling out the Informatics platform and when. It's being built now, and parts of it are up and running, but we expect over the coming months, various pieces of it will be rolled out. It may well take us close to a year to really fully put this thing in place, but parts of it will be coming out as the months go on. And we want to make sure it will be an open source platform and one that can function flexibly for, again, a 2-side study, a 50-side study, and will be interoperable with local platforms that may be available, including those that are, some of them are commercial.
Yeah, that's good. Let me actually, there was kind of a question related to that and it's really related to multiple approaches. Let's open the line for Jean-Hee Moon. The question has to do around, again, how to make sure things are successfully implemented. Can we hear comments about that? Jean, you want to say anything first?
Hey, Adrian, this is Darcy. She's a call-in user, so we're unable to unmute her at this time.
Okay. Well, her question has to do about the platform and any issues about functional abilities here, and especially as you go from pilot, so to speak, to full scale. And
yeah, well, again, Adrian, what I was trying to indicate was that in the pilot study that we're doing with CARA, some of it is using informatics, some of it is simply using a face page in the sense of the informatics and having a lot of behind-the-scenes work making this thing, standing this thing up, because we're using the pilot as a way of helping design what we want within the informatics platform. So it's in the process of being built now. We expect that it will allow this whole system to work smoothly. And someone was mentioning, maybe it was Pearl, who said, when you have 50 sites, how is this going to work with people calling from all over the place, and how big of a system do you need to stand this up? We anticipate that the informatics platform that we're building is going to really dramatically simplify this process.
Adrian.
Yeah, go.
So part of the problem in all of this is that because we've all been our own human research protection program silos at each institution for so long, we've all figured out our own ways to make it as efficient as possible and make it work with our system and our local laws and all that sort of stuff. And harmonization is a great goal, but it's also something that we have to take a step back and say it may not entirely be achievable. Our states all have different laws, and our universities or academic or institutions all run in different ways. And to think that we can all do something it may be true for a lot of it, but it's the one size may not fit all for every single thing. And that's part of the problem that's why there's so many Reliance models out there, and it's part of the problem with trying to come up with, just one that absolutely everybody can participate in and do things the same way.
That's very good. I agree. Let's, in the last couple minutes, let's
can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, this is Petra. I just wanted to say I agree that it's very challenging, but there is so much potential in trying to harmonize, and the impact could be just really very meaningful to what we're all trying to do, which is to bring more treatments to more patients more quickly. And so I think that to the extent that we can find a common kind of area of shared procedures, rules, and laws, it's true that, there's different states and so on, but perhaps a modular approach where one could agree on a set of workflow, procedure, IT, and some parts of a Reliance agreement, and then have some areas that could be modified based on specific situations, that could be something that could still help us pursue this very important goal of harmonizing while recognizing the challenges. Thank you.
Yeah, and Petra, this is Alan Green again. That's essentially, and Todd, that's essentially what we're trying to do. And so we understand that there's various state regulations that are important that we have to follow, and we take those into account. I don't want to take up much time because I know we're almost out of time.
Yeah, this is great. Maybe for the last minute, Petra and Rachel, any closing comments on this great topic here? Petra?
Yeah, thank you. So again, I'm just delighted that we had this opportunity, and we are working very well, especially Rachel and I, to try to coordinate between PCORnet, PCORI, and the Ctsa program and NCATS. We realize that it is challenging because this field is so rapidly evolving, and I think, Adrian, you used the word perfect storm. It's also a perfect opportunity, but I think the speed at which this change is happening is surpassing all of our wildest expectations. So it's really great to have a partner with PCORnet, and also, of course, at the NIH to have the Collaboratory and the many other NIH institutes. We're all really, behind this, and we appreciate the opportunity to use this as a forum to advance this important coordination effort. Thank you.
Yeah, and as I've said, America is dependent on it. So, Rachel, you get the last word. She may have had to leave since we're a little bit over the hour, but let me thank everyone for attending this special grand rounds based on attendance, comments, interests, and questions. Indeed, this is really an important area, and we will be addressing this periodically through grand rounds, and hope we can have Alan and Todd and others join again. Let me just leave with a reminder. We'll have grand rounds next week to talk about one of the pragmatic trials on choline-stimulating factor use in cancer with Scott Ramsey, so one of the new trials coming out, and what are the general lessons from that. So thanks, everyone, and a special thanks to our presenters.
Thank you, Adrian.
Thank you.
Have a good weekend.
Yeah, bye-bye.
Bye.